Imagine a man who rules an empire yet wakes before dawn not to command armies, but to speak quietly to himself. No audience, no applause. Just a tired human being reminding his own mind how to live without regret. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and what he practiced every day was not motivation, not affirmations, not positive thinking. It was daily reflection, a deliberate pause to examine his thoughts, his actions, and his failures before they hardened into lifelong regret. Most people think regret comes from big mistakes, a failed career, a broken relationship, a wrong decision that changed everything. Marcus Aurelius understood something deeper. Regret is born daily, in small, unnoticed moments, in the careless word spoken, in the duty postponed, in the emotion allowed to rule the mind. If these moments are left unexamined, they accumulate quietly like dust. One day you wake up and your life feels heavy, but you do not know why. Marcus wrote his reflections at night, often exhausted, often frustrated with people, often disappointed with himself. He did not write to impress, he wrote to correct. He believed that the mind, left alone, drifts toward comfort, ego, and excuses. Reflection was his way of pulling it back to reason. Think about your own day. From morning to night, how many decisions do you make on autopilot? How many reactions feel justified in the moment, but uncomfortable when remembered later? Marcus would say that regret is not fate, it is the unpaid debt of unexamined living. He reminds himself that each day is a complete life, not a rehearsal, not a draft, a full existence in itself. If you waste today, you have not lost a small thing. You have lost a piece of life that will never return. Daily reflection forces you to face this truth without drama. It asks one simple question: did I live today in alignment with my values, or did I trade them for convenience? Marcus did not ask himself whether he was happy. He asked whether he was just, disciplined, patient, and honest. Happiness, in his view, was a side effect of character, not the goal. Regret appears when character is neglected repeatedly, not when pleasure is missed. There is a powerful line hidden in his private notes. He tells himself not to act as if he has 10,000 years to live. This is not a threat, it is clarity. When you reflect daily, time stops being an abstract idea. It becomes personal. Today mattered. How you behaved today mattered. How you treated others mattered. How you governed your own impulses mattered. Without reflection, the mind protects itself with stories. I was tired. They deserved it. Tomorrow I will do better. Marcus Aurelius was ruthless with these excuses, especially his own. He believed self-deception was more dangerous than failure. Reflection was his defense. Picture him returning from court, from war reports, from political pressure, sitting alone with a wax tablet. He revisits the day not with shame but with precision. Where did anger take control? Where did fear speak louder than reason? Where did laziness disguise itself as rest? This was not self-punishment, this was training. He compares the mind to a muscle. If you do not test it daily, it weakens. Regret is simply the pain of discovering weakness too late. Most people avoid reflection because they think it will hurt. Marcus teaches the opposite. Reflection prevents pain by addressing it early. It is far easier to correct a small error at night than to repair a broken life years later. He also understood human nature deeply. He reminds himself that people will be selfish, ignorant, ungrateful, and difficult. Not as an insult, but as preparation. When you expect perfection, you accumulate resentment. When resentment goes unexamined, it becomes regret. Regret for relationships ruined not by others, but by your own unchecked reactions. Daily reflection creates space between event and response. In that space, freedom lives. Without it, you live reactively, and reactive living always ends in remorse. Marcus believed that every evening was a moral accounting, not to judge the world, but to judge his own alignment with reason. Did I act according to my nature as a rational and social being? Or did I behave like an animal chasing comfort and avoiding effort? He never assumed progress was permanent. Each day required renewal. This is why his reflections repeat the same themes again and again: death, discipline, impermanence, duty. not because he forgot, but because remembering is a practice, not an achievement. Regret often comes from thinking you already know. Reflection keeps you humble. It reminds you that knowing the good is not the same as doing the good. As you listen to this, you may feel the familiar urge to say, "I understand this." Marcus Aurelius would warn you gently. Understanding is cheap. Reflection is costly. It demands honesty when no one is watching. Tonight, when the day ends, the question is not whether you were busy, it is whether you were awake. Did you notice yourself living, or did the day happen to you? This is where the Stoic path begins, not in grand declarations, but in quiet nightly conversations with your own conscience. Conversations that, if practiced daily, slowly erase regret before it ever takes shape. Marcus Aurelius never treated reflection as something that looked only backward. For him, the night was not just for reviewing the day that had passed, but for preparing the soul for the day that was coming. Regret, he believed, is often born not from ignorance, but from being unprepared for what we already know will happen. He reminds himself again and again that tomorrow will bring difficult people, unexpected obstacles, and moments that test patience. This was not pessimism, it was realism. By anticipating challenges in reflection, he reduced their power. When the mind is prepared, it is less likely to react emotionally, and emotional reactions are the seeds of regret. Think about how regret usually forms. You say something sharp because you were surprised. You act selfishly because you felt threatened. You abandon discipline because temptation appeared suddenly. Marcus understood that surprise is the enemy of virtue. Reflection removes surprise by bringing reality into the mind in advance. At night he would rehearse his role as a human being, not as an emperor, not as a hero, but as a rational creature among other rational creatures. He asks himself what his duty is likely to be tomorrow: to remain calm under insult, to work without complaint, to accept discomfort without drama. By doing this, he steps into the next day already aligned with his values. Most people wake up and allow the day to define them. Marcus Aurelius believed the opposite was possible. Through reflection, you define yourself before the world tries to do it for you. This is how regret is prevented at its root. You are not constantly repairing damage, you are reducing the chance of damage occurring. There is a quiet strength in this approach. It does not rely on willpower alone. It relies on clarity. When you know in advance what kind of person you intend to be, decisions become simpler. Not easier, but simpler. And simplicity is a powerful defense against regret. Marcus often reminds himself that external events are not the problem. His judgments about them are. Reflection trains the mind to recognize this distinction. By reviewing past reactions, he learns which judgments led to peace and which led to disturbance. Over time, this creates wisdom that no book can teach. He also understood that regret thrives in vagueness. When values are unclear, actions become confused. Reflection sharpens values by forcing them into language. What does justice mean today? What does self-control look like in real situations? What does courage require when fear is present? These questions, asked daily, transform philosophy from theory into behavior. There is an almost military discipline to the way Marcus approaches the mind. He does not wait for motivation. He does not negotiate with weakness. He prepares, anticipates, and accepts. Reflection is his strategy room, where he studies his own patterns more carefully than any enemy. He writes reminders to himself that life is short, not to induce anxiety, but to remove hesitation. When time is seen clearly, excuses lose their charm. Regret often comes from delay, not from wrong action. Reflection exposes delay as a choice, not an accident. Imagine waking up each morning already aware that you will face resistance, boredom, and frustration. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, you feel steady. Nothing is personal, nothing is shocking. This is the power Marcus Aurelius cultivated through nightly reflection. He knew that if the mind enters the day untrained, it will be trained by circumstances, and circumstances have no interest in your character. They shape you randomly unless you intervene. Reflection is that intervention. There is a subtle shift that happens when reflection becomes a habit. You stop asking how things make you feel and start asking how you ought to respond. This shift alone dissolves much of the regret that haunts people later in life. Marcus also warned himself against the illusion of progress. He knew that a good day does not make a good character. Only consistent alignment does. Reflection keeps progress honest by revealing patterns rather than isolated victories. He did not expect perfection from himself. He expected effort. And effort, when guided by daily examination, compounds quietly. Regret, on the other hand, compounds loudly when examination is avoided. As you listen, notice how this practice requires no special tools, no journal with perfect handwriting, no elaborate rituals, just honesty and attention. Marcus Aurelius often wrote to himself while exhausted, while sick, while burdened with responsibility. Reflection was not something he did when life was calm, it was how he stayed calm within life. When night falls and the world goes silent, the mind has a choice, to distract itself or to confront itself. Marcus chose confrontation, not because he enjoyed it, but because he valued freedom from regret more than comfort. Marcus Aurelius knew something that most people learn too late. Failure itself does not create regret. What creates regret is how we relate to failure. Avoid it, excuse it, or bury it, and it returns later with interest. Face it calmly, and it becomes instruction. Daily reflection was his way of turning mistakes into teachers rather than judges. When Marcus looked back on his day, he did not ask whether he had failed. He assumed that he had. This assumption removed drama. Failure was not an identity, it was an event, something that happened, something to be studied, something to be corrected. Regret grows when failure is treated as shame. Reflection dissolves shame by replacing it with understanding. He remin. D.S. himself that he is a human being, not a god. Humans are designed to err. What matters is not the absence of error, but the speed and sincerity of correction. Regret is slow correction, reflection is immediate correction. Think about how people usually deal with mistakes. They either justify them or punish themselves endlessly. Both paths lead away from growth. Marcus Aurelius chose a third path. Honest acknowledgement without emotional excess. He would note where he acted poorly, not to feel bad, but to act better next time. There is a line in his thinking that is deeply liberating. He tells himself that if something can be corrected, there is no need for distress, and if it cannot be corrected, distress is useless. This single idea, when reflected upon daily, removes a tremendous amount of regret from life. Regret often comes from replaying the past with emotional intensity, but no wisdom. Reflection replays the past with clarity and restraint. It asks what was in your control and what was not. This distinction is the foundation of Stoic peace. Marcus was especially attentive to moments when he betrayed his own standards, not because he enjoyed self-criticism, but because self-betrayal leaves the deepest scars. When you act against your values, even in small ways, the mind remembers. Reflection brings these moments into the light before they turn into quiet self-contempt. He also understood that memory is unreliable. The mind reshapes the past to protect the ego. Reflection anchors memory in truth by recording it while it is still fresh. This prevents regret from becoming distorted into exaggerated guilt or false innocence. Imagine ending each day knowing that nothing is hidden from yourself, no lies, no unresolved tension. Even if the day was flawed, it is complete. There is peace in completion. Regret thrives in unfinished psychological business. Marcus Aurelius often spoke to himself like a strict but fair teacher. He did not insult himself. He did not soften the lesson either. He named the behavior clearly: anger, vanity, laziness, fear. By naming these forces, he reduced their power. There is something profoundly empowering about this. When you stop being afraid of seeing yourself clearly, you stop being controlled by what you avoid. Reflection turns self-knowledge into self-command. He also reminds himself that tomorrow is not guaranteed. This awareness sharpens reflection. Mistakes left unexamined today may never be corrected. Regret is often the pain of realizing that the chance to act differently has passed forever. Daily reflection shortens the distance between intention and action. Instead of waiting for a crisis to force change, change happens quietly, incrementally. This is why Marcus Aurelius could endure immense pressure without breaking inwardly. His inner world was constantly maintained. Most people wait for regret to motivate change. Marcus reversed the process. He used reflection to motivate prevention. Why wait for pain to teach a lesson that reason can teach now? As you consider your own life, notice how often regret is connected to silence, things you did not say, actions you postponed, boundaries you did not set. Reflection gives voice to these silences before they harden into permanent loss. Marcus did not believe that dwelling on mistakes made one weak. He believed avoiding them did. Strength, in his view, was the ability to look directly at your own shortcomings without flinching or collapsing. This approach changes your relationship with time. The past is no longer a source of torment. It becomes a library. Each day adds a page. Reflection is the act of reading before the book grows too heavy to lift. Marcus Aurelius never believed that emotions were enemies. What he feared was unconscious. Emotion that arrives unnoticed, takes control, and leaves regret behind. Daily reflection was his method for tracing emotions back to their source before they ruled his behavior. He observed that emotions do not appear suddenly. They announce themselves quietly. Irritation before anger, desire before obsession, fear before avoidance. Reflection trained him to recognize these early signals. Regret, he understood, is rarely caused by the first feeling. It is caused by the action that follows when the feeling is not examined. Most people judge their emotions or surrender to them. Marcus did neither. He studied them. At night he would revisit moments where emotion influenced his choices, not to condemn the feeling, but to question the judgment attached to it. Why did this disturb me? What belief was threatened? What expectation was violated? This questioning weakens the illusion that emotions are facts. They are interpretations. Reflection exposes interpretation as optional, and when interpretation changes, behavior follows. He often reminds himself that the mind has the power to withdraw assent. Just because a thought appears does not mean it must be believed. Just because anger arises does not mean it must be obeyed. Reflection strengthens this inner veto power. Consider how regret around emotions usually forms. You lose your temper and later wish you had remained calm. You act out of fear and later realize the danger was exaggerated. These are not failures of feeling, they are failures of pause. Reflection installs that pause. Marcus Aurelius believed that the evening review should include emotional honesty. Where did pride speak? Where did envy whisper? Where did pleasure seduce reason? By naming these moments, he made them familiar. Familiarity reduces emotional shock in the future. He also understood that emotions feed on narratives. The story you tell yourself determines the intensity of what you feel. Reflection rewrites these stories. Instead of saying I was disrespected, he asks what harm was actually done. Instead of saying I was wronged, he asks whether virtue was truly threatened. This shift is subtle but powerful. When virtue becomes the measure, most emotional injuries lose their force. Regret fades because reactions become proportional rather than impulsive. Marcus frequently reminded himself that other people's behavior is outside his control. What remains under his control is his own response. Reflection reinforces this boundary daily. Without this boundary, emotional regret becomes inevitable. There is a particular kind of regret that comes from emotional overinvestment, caring too much about praise, fearing criticism excessively, chasing approval at the cost of integrity. Marcus saw these patterns clearly in himself and worked on them relentlessly through reflection. He would ask himself whether he acted for the common good or for personal validation. This question alone dismantles many emotional traps. When actions are aligned with duty rather than ego, regret has little space to grow. He also knew that emotional suppression leads to delayed regret. Unexpressed anger turns into bitterness. Ignored fear turns into avoidance. Reflection allows emotions to be acknowledged without being indulged. This balance is at the heart of Stoic emotional mastery. Imagine ending each day knowing that no emotion was left unconscious. You may still feel sadness, frustration, or desire, but they no longer control the future. They have been seen, understood, and placed in perspective. Marcus Aurelius did not seek to become emotionless. He sought to become unenslaved. Reflection was the key that loosened emotional chains without denying human experience. As this practice deepens, something unexpected happens. You begin to trust yourself. You know that even if a strong emotion arises, it will be examined later. This trust reduces fear of your own mind, and fear of the mind is a hidden source of regret. For Marcus Aurelius, the greatest source of regret was not pain, loss, or failure. It was inconsistency, living one way in thought and another way in action. Daily reflection was his method for restoring unity between what he believed and how he lived. He believed that a fragmented life slowly exhausts the soul. When values are spoken but not practiced, the mind senses the contradiction. This inner conflict does not always scream. It whispers, and over time those whispers become regret. Each evening Marcus returned to a single quiet question. Did I live today according to my nature, not my mood, not my convenience, my nature as a rational social being capable of reason and virtue? Reflection was the mirror that revealed the answer without flattery. Most people regret not the events of their lives, but the version of themselves they failed to be. Marcus understood this deeply. That is why his reflections focus less on outcomes and more on conduct. You cannot control results, but you are always responsible for alignment. He reminds himself that no role excuses vice, not power, not fatigue, not injustice. Being an emperor did not give him permission to be arrogant. Being tired did not justify cruelty. Reflection stripped away excuses until only responsibility remained. There is something demanding but freeing in this view. When responsibility is accepted fully, blame loses its appeal. Regret often grows from blaming others for choices that were always ours. Reflection returns ownership to where it belongs. Marcus also understood that values must be translated into behavior daily, or they decay into slogans. Justice means fairness in small interactions. Courage means speak. In truth, when silence is easier. Temperance means restraint, even when indulgence is available. Reflection forces these ideals into specific actions. He did not ask abstract questions, he asked practical ones. Where did I act unjustly? Where did I avoid effort? Where did I place comfort above character? These questions sharpen conscience and prevent moral drift. Regret is often the realization that you compromised too many times. Reflection interrupts compromise while it is still small. It exposes patterns early before they become identity. Marcus believed that the mind should govern the body, not serve it. Hunger, pleasure, fatigue, and desire were facts, not commands. Reflection reinforced this hierarchy every day. When the body ruled unchecked, regret followed. He also warned himself against performing virtue for an audience. True alignment happens when no one is watching. Reflection occurs in solitude because character is built there. Regret comes when public image replaces private integrity. Imagine living in such a way that each night you can account for your actions without excuses. The day may not have been perfect, but it was honest. That honesty brings a deep kind of rest that sleep alone cannot provide. Marcus Aurelius knew that death would eventually close the book on his life. Reflection was his way of making sure each page made sense in relation to the whole. A life without coherence feels incomplete, no matter how successful it appears. He did not chase greatness, he chased consistency. Greatness, in his view, was a byproduct of sustained alignment over time. As you reflect on your own day, notice how often regret is tied to moments when you knew better but chose easier. Reflection strengthens the part of you that chooses better next time. This practice does not make life simpler externally. Problems remain, people remain difficult, uncertain. Thank you remains. But internally, life becomes clearer, and clarity is the soil in which regret cannot easily grow. Marcus Aurelius never separated daily reflection from the awareness of death. For him, remembering mortality was not morbid, it was practical. Regret, he believed, is the pain of realizing too late what mattered while time was still available. Each evening he reminded himself that life is fragile and uncertain, not to frighten himself, but to strip away illusion. When death is kept in mind, trivial concerns lose authority. Reflection, combined with mortality, becomes a powerful filter for decision-making. Most people live as if time is abundant. Marcus lived as if time was on loan. This difference shaped everything. When you assume you will live long, you delay courage, honesty, and discipline. When you remember that tomorrow is not promised, delay becomes irrational. Regret often sounds like this: I thought I had more time. Marcus Aurelius treated this thought as dangerous. Reflection was his daily antidote. He would ask himself whether he lived that day as someone who might not wake again. Not dramatically, simply honestly. Did he speak truthfully? Did he fulfill his duty? Did he waste energy on things unworthy of attention? Mortality sharpens reflection by adding weight to choices. It transforms ordinary moments into final opportunities. This awareness does not paralyze, it clarifies. Marcus reminds himself that death can arrive at any moment. In childhood, in old age, in the middle of responsibility. Knowing this, he sees no reason to postpone virtue. Why wait to become just, calm, or disciplined? There is a unique regret that comes from surviving without having lived intentionally. Marcus sought to avoid this fate through constant remembrance. Reflection ensures that each day stands on its own, complete and sufficient. He also believed that death creates more regret than death itself. Fear causes people to cling, compromise, and betray values. Reflection dissolves this fear by normalizing impermanence. When you accept that everything passes, you stop demanding permanence from temporary things. Relationships become more sincere. Work becomes more focused. Conflict becomes less consuming. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on how many emperors, generals, and philosophers had already vanished. Their fame did not save them. Their power did not extend their time. This humbled him. It also freed him. Regret thrives when we chase immortality through status, praise, or legacy. Reflection reveals the futility of this chase. What remains meaningful is how you acted while alive. By remembering death daily, Marcus made peace with limits. He stopped expecting life to be fair, long, or comfortable. This acceptance removed a vast source of resentment and regret. Imagine living each day knowing it could be your last, not in panic but in presence. You would choose words more carefully. You would waste less energy on bitterness. You would act more in line with who you want to be remembered as. Marcus did not seek to be remembered. He sought to be right with himself. Reflection was his private witness. There is a quiet courage that comes from this practice. When death is no longer denied, life is no longer postponed. Regret loses its future tense. As this awareness deepens, daily reflection becomes sacred time, not ritualistic but real, a moment to ask whether the life being lived matches the life being given. Marcus Aurelius understood that many of life's deepest regrets are not about careers or achievements, but about people, words said in anger, patience withheld, understanding refused. Daily reflection was his shield against becoming hardened by human interaction. He accepted a difficult truth. You cannot control how others behave, but you will always live with how you respond. Regret grows when reactions violate your own standards, not when others disappoint you. Each evening, Marcus reflected on his encounters with people, not to judge them, but to examine himself. Where did I allow irritation to turn into cruelty? Where did I mistake impatience for honesty? Where did I forget that others act from ignorance rather than malice? This perspective softened his judgments without weakening his principles. He reminds himself that people do wrong because they do not know better, or because they are struggling internally. Understanding this does not excuse harm, but it prevents bitterness. Bitterness, Marcus believed, is a form of self-harm. It poisons the mind that holds it. Reflection helps release it before it settles. He often prepared himself for the day by expecting ingratitude, arrogance, and selfishness. When these appeared, he was not shocked, and what does not shock rarely scars. Regret in relationships often comes from unrealistic expectations, expecting others to be as rational, fair, or disciplined as we wish ourselves to be. Reflection corrects these expectations gently but firmly. Marcus also warned himself not to become like the people he disliked. Resentment invites imitation. You adopt the very behaviors you condemn. Reflection exposes this danger early. He would ask himself whether he responded as a fellow human being or as an offended ego. This single distinction changes everything. When ego leads, regret follows. When humanity leads, peace follows. There is a particular regret that comes from withholding kindness, moments where compassion was possible, but pride intervened. Marcus considered these missed opportunities serious losses. Reflection brought them into awareness. He believed that every interaction was a chance to practice virtue. Patience, why? The difficult. Fairness with the unfair. Calm with the chaotic. Reflection turned daily life into training rather than trial. Marcus also understood boundaries. Reflection did not mean tolerating injustice or abuse. It meant responding with reason rather than impulse, firmness without hatred, distance without contempt. He knew that people would forget words, forget favors, forget intentions. What they would not forget is how you made them feel. Reflection ensured that his conduct left minimal harm behind. Relational regret often appears years later, a realization that bridges were burned unnecessarily. Reflection prevents this by cooling reactions before they become permanent consequences. There is freedom in accepting that you cannot fix others. Reflection returns focus to the only area where improvement is always possible, yourself. Marcus Aurelius did not seek harmony at any cost. He sought integrity. When integrity guides interaction, even conflict can be lived without regret. As you listen, consider how many unresolved interactions still live in your memory. Moments that feel heavy not because of what others did, but because of how you responded. Reflection is the path to release. Marcus Aurelius did not believe that identity was something you discovered once and kept forever. He believed identity was something you practiced daily. Without reflection, identity becomes accidental. With reflection, it becomes intentional. Regret, in his view, is often the realization that you became someone you never consciously chose to be. Each day, through reflection, Marcus asked himself who he was becoming through repeated actions, not who he wanted to appear as, but who his habits were shaping him into. Character, he believed, is simply behavior repeated long enough to feel natural. Most people think of identity as fixed. Marcus saw it as fluid but directional, ever. Decision nudges the self in a certain direction. Reflection reveals that direction early, before it is too late to change course. Regret often sounds like this: I do not recognize myself anymore. Marcus prevented this by never allowing days to pass unnoticed. Reflection was his compass, constantly correcting drift. He reminds himself that the soul takes the shape of its thoughts. What you dwell on, you become. Reflection exposes the patterns of attention that quietly shape identity. Where was my focus today? On status, on resentment, on fear, on virtue. This awareness is powerful. When you see what is shaping you, you regain authorship. Without reflection, life writes you. With reflection, you write yourself. Marcus Aurelius believed that identity is not built in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. How you speak when tired, how you act when no reward is visible, how you behave when no one is watching. Reflection brings significance to these small moments. There is a deep regret that comes from living reactively, from letting circumstances dictate who you are allowed to be. Marcus resisted this by reaffirming his principles daily. Reflection was his daily oath. He often reminds himself that he was born to work with others, not to dominate or withdraw. This belief shaped his identity as a servant of the common good, rather than a ruler above it. Reflection reinforced this orientation again and again. Identity confusion creates anxiety. Anxiety leads to impulsive choices. Impulsivity leads to regret. Reflection interrupts this chain by stabilizing the sense of self. Marcus did not ask whether his life felt exciting. He asked whether it felt aligned. Alignment produces a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. He also understood that identity can decay. Even a disciplined person can become careless. Even a just person can become cruel. Reflection was his maintenance, preventing slow moral erosion. Imagine living in such a way that years later, when you look back, the line of your character makes sense, not perfect, but coherent. This coherence is the opposite of regret. Marcus Aurelius accepted that change is inevitable. What he refused was unconscious change. Reflection ensured that evolution happened with intention rather than neglect. As days turn into years, this practice compounds. You do not suddenly wake up wise, you wake up familiar with yourself. Familiarity brings mastery. Marcus Aurelius lived in a world that was anything but calm. War at the borders, betrayal in politics, plague in the cities, pressure that never paused. And yet, when we read his reflections, we do not hear a man drowning in chaos. We hear a man creating inner order every single day. He knew that the deepest regret is not suffering external disorder, but allowing that disorder to fracture the inner self. Daily reflection was how he restored order when the world offered none. He understood that chaos outside is unavoidable, but chaos inside is optional. Most people confuse the two. They believe that when life becomes noisy, confusing, or unfair, inner turmoil is justified. Marcus rejected this completely. Reflection was his way of separating what happens from what is allowed to rule the mind. Regret often comes from saying, "I lost myself during that time." Marcus Aurelius never wanted to lose himself, no matter how intense circumstances became. Reflection was the anchor that kept his identity stable while everything else shifted. Each evening, he would mentally return from the battlefield of the day. Not physically, but psychologically. He would ask whether events had pulled him away from reason, whether urgency had replaced judgment, whether pressure had replaced principle. This practice did something subtle but profound. It prevented accumulation. Stress unexamined turns into bitterness. Pressure unexamined turns into cruelty. Fatigue unexamined turns into self-pity. Reflection releases these pressures daily before they solidify into regret. Marcus reminds himself that confusion comes not from events, but from conflicting values. When you want comfort and virtue at the same time, approval and honesty at the same time, control and acceptance at the same time, reflection forces a choice, and choice restores order. He believed that the soul needs structure just as much as the body needs routine. Without structure, the mind becomes reactive. Reaction leads to inconsistency. Inconsistency leads to regret. In reflection, Marcus realigned priorities. What truly matters, what does not, what deserves attention, what deserves indifference. This daily sorting kept his inner world uncluttered. Most people regret how they behaved under pressure. They say things they did not mean. They abandon standards they once respected. Marcus trained himself to remain recognizable even in crisis. Reflection was rehearsal for difficulty. He often reminded himself that events cannot harm character unless character cooperates. This idea sounds simple, but living it requires constant reinforcement. Reflection was that reinforcement. When chaos strikes, the unreflected mind searches for someone to blame. The reflected mind searches for the correct response. One path multiplies regret, the other dissolves it. Marcus also understood that inner conflict drains life energy. When values fight each other, exhaustion follows. Reflection resolves conflict by clarifying hierarchy, reason above impulse, duty above comfort, integrity above outcome. He did not expect the world to slow down for his clarity. He created clarity independently. This is why his thoughts feel timeless. They were forged under pressure, not in comfort. Imagine ending each day knowing that no matter how chaotic it was, your inner state was examined, corrected, and restored. Sleep becomes deeper when the mind is at peace with itself. Marcus Aurelius believed that a disordered mind cannot live without regret because it cannot act consistently. Reflection brings consistency even when circumstances are inconsistent. He reminds himself that peace is not found by arranging the world, but by arranging the mind. This arrangement happens daily or not at all. Regret is often the echo of inner disorder remembered too late. Reflection silences that echo by addressing disorder immediately. As you listen to this, consider how often chaos outside has become justification for chaos inside. Reflection removes that justification. It restores responsibility gently but firmly. Marcus did not wait for life to calm down. He calmed himself daily so that life could not unmake him. Marcus Aurelius believed that a life without daily reflection is a life lived in fragments. Days pile up, years pass, and one morning you wake up older, carrying a weight you cannot name. That weight is unexamined living. That weight becomes regret. His entire practice was designed to prevent reaching the end of life and realizing that attention was never truly given to how one lived. For Marcus, daily reflection turned each day into a complete life. Born in the morning, tested by noon, judged by night. When a day is completed in this way, it does not leak unfinished business into the future. Regret feeds on unfinished days. He reminds himself that you do not need decades to live well. You need clarity today. If today is lived according to reason and virtue, then even a short life is sufficient. Without reflection, even a long life feels incomplete. This is why Marcus wrote to himself so persistently, not because he lacked intelligence, because he respected how easily the mind forgets what matters. Reflection was remembrance, a daily return to first principles. Most people imagine regret as something that appears at the end of life. Marcus understood that regret is created daily, silently, when actions drift away from values. Reflection intercepts that drift before it becomes irreversible. He believed that old age should not be a time of apology to oneself. It should be a time of quiet acceptance. Acceptance is only possible when you know you did your best with what you understood at the time. Reflection makes that knowledge honest. Marcus did not promise himself comfort. He promised himself coherence, that his thoughts, words, and actions would belong to the same person. This coherence is what allows a person to look back without bitterness. There is a powerful calm in knowing that you did not abandon yourself. Even when you failed, you corrected. Even when you fell short, you noticed. Regret softens when effort was sincere. Daily reflection also removes the fear of looking back. When each day is examined, the past does not accumulate shadows. It becomes familiar territory. You know where you struggled and where you stood firm. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself that life is movement. You are either progressing toward virtue or drifting away from it. Reflection tells you which is happening. Without it, drift feels like progress until it is too late. He believed that the final measure of a life is not intensity, pleasure, or recognition. It is whether the soul remained in harmony with itself. Reflection preserves that harmony. As years pass, habits harden. Reflection ensures they harden in the right direction. What you examine improves. What you ignore decays. This law applies to character more than anything else. Imagine reaching the end of life without the sharp pain of "I should have known." Better. Instead, there is a quiet recognition. I paid attention. I corrected when I could. I lived deliberately. This is the freedom Marcus Aurelius was protecting himself from losing. Not freedom from hardship, but freedom from self-reproach. Daily reflection is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming conscious. Conscious living leaves little room for regret because nothing essential was ignored. As this series ends, remember this: the Stoic practice is not heavy. It is lightening. It removes excess emotion, excess excuse, excess illusion. Tonight, when the day ends, there will be a moment of silence. In that moment, you can choose distraction or you can choose reflection. One choice numbs regret temporarily. The other prevents it permanently. Marcus Aurelius chose reflection, quietly, consistently, alone. And because of that, his life, though filled with hardship, remained internally free.